Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Localization in Finance Best Practices for Setting Efficient Workflows webinar. We are about 1 minute late. We could wait a little bit longer to give more people a chance to come on, but I think we should just go ahead and dive in and people will catch up. So if you're in the finance or insurance industry and trying to understand some of the best practices for localization, you're in the right place. This webinar is aimed at people who have some experience or are strongly considering localizing their app or other digital assets. So just to set a few ground rules, you'll see that there's a chat window and a questions window. The chat window is you can use to introduce yourselves or do other chat types of things if you'd like to. But if you have a question, it would really help us if you use the question area. That'll make it easy for us to identify and answer those questions. Now, we have about 40 minutes of content, and we'll answer most of the questions at the end. But if there's a question that is better answered as we're going along, I'll try to identify that and get the answer while we're going. So without further ado, I'm Spencer, and I manage the marketing team here at Lokalise, and I'm relatively new to the localization industry, and I'm looking forward to learn from Alesia. Okay, enough from me. Let's bring her on.
Hey folks, my name is Alesia and I'm from the customer success team in Lokalise. And my journey with Lokalise started more than a year ago. And so far, I got lucky to work with dozens of customers from various industries using Lokalise. But the biggest part of my portfolio consisted of finance-related companies. And some of them were really very mature in localization. So there are lots of things that I've learned from them, as well as from my colleagues and our partners. So I'll be happy to share some insights on this. And personally, finance and financial technology is something that I'm very interested in myself.
Now, in this audience, we have attendees who are representing several different types of financial companies, from traditional banks to newer fintech companies. Some of them are focused business to consumer. Some of them are focused on business to business. And so you, Alesia, work across all of these. Can you tell us some of the main differences you notice in those businesses and how they approach localization?
Yeah, sure. If I had to focus on just a few major differences, and if I had to split all types of customers in just two groups, then I would say that the approaches of banks and some other really mature, established financial institutions are rather different from the ones that from younger financial and insurance tech players. So for the first group, there is often a larger number of stakeholders involved in each step of their localization journey, and there are several reasons for that. So one of them will definitely be the product complexity, because over time they tend to build their products that are becoming fairly complex, and they also have quite large ranges of services that they provide the customers with. So they can be some payments, wealth management, investments, credits, and other types of services involved. These teams are typically much larger in sizes, and also due to regulation, it requires lots of approval stages from them and lots of parties to be involved. For example, compliance and legal sometimes before the final version of the copy and localized materials gets accepted. And it can be harder for such players to introduce new tools, and it's not that easy for them to introduce some major changes into their localization approach. Can be due to technical debt, due to lengthy approval processes. And there are lots of also security and compliance criteria that any third-party tool has to pass. But regulations and certain restrictions, they also tend to differ from market to market. So, and products and services they provide can differ, or they can be limited in some markets, or they can be named differently in some markets. So there are often quite different user journeys or completely different applications that banks and similar institutions tend to launch across markets. So each of them is usually localized and translated separately and in few local languages only. But there are exceptions, of course. And to me, it seems that banks, for example, they see more value in having localization tools like ours, as in having a place where teams can collaborate, where they can manage multiple approval stages, have visibility and control. over the content that they're localizing or have localized before in some of the markets. And whereas younger products focused on technology, they fall under fewer regulations. And this can be either due to limited scope of services, since they often tend to focus on disrupting just a particular type of traditional financial service. They can focus on payments or trading only or investments only, or they can focus on and pick a service that is subject to a more standardized regulation across countries. So to some extent, these products, they are launched initially with globalization mindset. So, and they tend to have less technical depth and less legacy content. And all this makes it easier for them to scale and enter new markets. So they sometimes a little bit more agile and thus demanding in terms of technology and efficiency that localization tools and localization processes can provide them with. So this is where they see the value of tools like ours a little bit differently, and take also lots of value from some productivity and like technology and custom integration that are available with us. And the approaches are also very different among business to consumer and business to business technology companies, because business to business players, they don't just localize content in multiple languages, but they often have to maintain same products, same functionality, but with a quite different copy for different partners. They can have some white label product solutions. So they tend to have quite different workflows and separate these parts, but at the same time, they want to reuse some and manage translations efficiently. So these are all the things that one has to keep in mind when trying to build some localization processes.
Great. So let's get to the meat of this presentation. And in the audience, I'm sure there are some people who are just getting started localizing, and there's some that are pretty far down that path, and they've been doing this for a little while. But you were telling me when we were preparing that across all of your clients, even those that have been doing this for a while are skipping some of the core best practices, either because they didn't know about it, or maybe they got started without it and they've never made the time to come back and do those things. So let's get started there. What are some of the absolute must-dos for finance companies?
Probably number one that comes to my mind is related to the fact that financial products are usually fairly complex in terminology. And it seems like a rather obvious piece of advice to look for translators and companies that specializes in translations for the industry and who can get this content. But it's not that easy, and it's not always the case that I see. And many companies in the industry that I worked with, they choose to perform translations in-house, or at least do some in-house revisions of translations made by third parties due to multiple reasons. And one of them is the complexity of products and terms that their own teams can be better aware of. And in any case, translating in-house or with the help of a vendor, I would definitely suggest to build a glossary where all the relevant concepts, products, descriptions, and approved translations will be added and explained.
All right, so let me stop you right there. I mean, I understand what a glossary is. It's a place where you can look up words. But how does it work? Let's say I'm a translator or a linguist and I find a word I don't quite understand and I go to the glossary. Is that what I should do? And so like what kinds of words are in there and who usually builds and maintains it?
Yeah, you can think of it as of a dictionary where you can put all the terms and translations that you want translators to be aware of. And one can also explain meanings of the terms and abbreviations by adding some descriptions to them. You can set some and explain some non-translatable words like names of products and stocks. And one can also add some predefined translations for certain terms and products that should be named in a certain way in order to either resonate with the brand and the nature of service, or in order to follow some regulations, some product naming conventions across the markets. And if both the translations and the glossary are managed in our tool, then the glossary terms pop up to translators automatically. whenever they happen to face the term in the source language, the language that they're translating from. And in other instances, the glossary can be downloaded, it can be shared with all the relevant parties who can manage the glossary and translations elsewhere. And as for maintaining it, it really depends. It can be the customer who's responsible for this. In this case, it would probably be the person responsible for translation quality, localization manager, or it can be a joint effort of linguists, for example, language leads. And depending on the arrangements, this can also be outsourced from your language service provider.
And as we mentioned at the start, this is a highly regulated industry where using the wrong term or being inconsistent with your words can have serious consequences. So I can see the value in having a glossary. When should companies start creating one?
I would say that it makes sense to start building one from the very beginning, saving yourselves time and effort in the future, since it's a very powerful feature to manage consistency and quality of translations. And sometimes I see customers that have been operating in markets for years, localizing into multiple languages, like in dozens of languages, that are looking for new translation services and have nothing to transfer as a glossary. So at this point in time, it can be quite a big project and quite huge time investment. So starting early is definitely helpful. And as you can imagine, it will be work in progress since there will be some new features built, some new products built, and there can be some changes in regulations that can also force things to be renamed and some terms to be removed or updated. And actually, one of the biggest glossaries in Lokalise now is owned by a trading company.
So I have to ask, and I'm sure we're all curious about it. How big is their glossary?
This one particularly, it contains around like 3,000 of terms, and there are different types of words and phrases there. So like starting from some general financial concepts explained that are used in the products and applications, to some types of financial assets, instruments, like names of stocks, various kinds of abbreviations that one cannot really easily understand. And there are like also names of security exchanges, supervising authorities, and like many other things like that.
Wow. So some companies, as you mentioned before, especially when they get started, have translators as employees. That's what I used to do at a previous company. You know, if we had a product launch, I would send the materials to the German-speaking or the French-speaking marketers, and they would do the translation. But honestly, we weren't very sophisticated, and we had a hard time making that process scale. I'm guessing that a lot of your customers are a bit more mature than I used to be, and they use a language service provider or an LSP. What advice do you have to set up the best practices between a client and an LSP?
Actually, I would start from the fact that it's actually very different from team to team in the industry. Some might decide to translate in-house in the beginning and switch to an LSP later, and some can decide to maintain it in-house and build dedicated in-house translation departments. And I often see some hybrid approaches with separate pipelines created for translations, depending on the type of the content, depending on the urgency, and other things. So choosing the right provider is a challenging thing in itself. And I think it's a big separate topic that we won't be covering here. But once we get there and pick the vendor, one shall make sure that first the expectations for translation quality are defined from the very beginning in order to avoid some mismatch in expectations later on and minimize some preferential changes. And later on, when it comes to revising translations and assessing linguistic quality, for which you cannot use some automatic QA checks, then ideally there should be some feedback loop with the vendor so that some major issues and trends are identified, discussed, and worked on. And there is some alignment in expectations and also a learning curve involved. And one shall definitely think through the process for prioritization and submission of some ad hoc and last-minute localization requests, since especially in the financial industry, there can be some very serious announcement made or revisions requested, and it might not be possible or be rather hard to squeeze such requests into the translation pipeline or into your automation. So it might be useful to have a backup for such cases, like in-house linguists, some freelancers, or another agency to cover some spikes in volumes, urgency, or absence if there are internal translators involved. And there also shall be a process of building and keeping up to date the localization assets, such as glossary, translation memories, style guides, that can be managed either by your translation partner or by the company's own localization department, so that it can be shared among multiple vendors and all the parties that perform translations for you.
So in that, we talked a little bit about the glossary already, but let's discuss a little bit more the style guide and the translation memory. How can teams benefit from creating and sharing those?
There are teams with very strong brand voices that check how well translations resonate with their brand and whether they sound human enough or, for example, friendly or formal enough. So in some cases, it can be as if the company has its own language style in which it communicates with with their customers. And I actually notice this more often among younger technology companies that try to transform user experience and make financial products look and sound easier to understand, or simply they can try to make them more appealing to some younger audiences. So like companies like Lemonade, TransferGo, Lunar, Revolut can be just to name a few. And this is where documented brand and style guides can be very useful to, like, if you share them with your partners. And when it comes to the translation memory, then one has to think about the right process from the very beginning. It's a rather powerful feature that remembers how translations were performed, and it suggests them for new pieces of text being translated to ensure consistency of translations or to pre-translate some content, similar or the same content. But in order to use it efficiently, one has to carefully think about translations that are being added to this memory so that they can be safely reused in the future. And if there are, in the case, if there are some quality issues with previous translations, or if there are totally unrelated applications being translated, or if there are like products with mixed quality of translations, like some machine translation and some human, then it makes sense sometimes to segregate these translation memories from each other, because if you put everything like in one place, later it can be rather costly in terms of time and effort if you decide to split them or audit the translation memory afterwards.
Okay, great. And I should mention in this presentation, obviously, we've included some links. You can't click on them during the webinar, but we're going to be distributing the deck later. So if you want to read more, that's why the links are in there. So if I put myself in the seat of a linguist, someone who's doing the translations, I can see how translation memory and a glossary could help me with my speed and my quality, my accuracy. But that can only take you so far. You may run into a word like open, which in some places might be like open a new account or our location is open today. So it's both a verb and an adjective. The translation, therefore, depends entirely in the context. So how can we help linguists in those cases?
Yeah, it's a good question, and you're right. And it's a quite common situation in the industry, and not only and like globally in localization. And once we asked a neobank how they deal with provision of context for external translators, and asked if they provide them with any screenshots. And they said that they just pray that their translators can get it. So the least you can do here is to manually add comments and some descriptions for strings that can be ambiguous or cumbersome to understand. And you can attach screenshots to them as well. And it will be much more efficient to upload screenshots in bulk for all such screens. So that optical character recognition machine tries to recognize the text on the screenshot, finds the same text in the translation management system, and tries to map them screenshots to the relevant keys and strings.
All right, so I think we have to slow down just a little bit because I went too fast for somebody like me. So a designer or someone else from the team can upload the screenshots of the app, and that will automatically match the screenshots to existing keys and strings. So then the translators who work on the translations can see the screenshot and they can understand what the context is, and that gives them and give the best translation there. And there's no prayer required in that process.
Yeah, exactly like that. And the most powerful way is, by the way, this is how it looks like. And the most powerful way is to use integrations with design tools to upload screenshots and map them to text in a similar way, and to be able to sync translations back into design in order to preview translations in the design, both to check how it fits into the layouts of design and check how translations fit next to each other. And actually, the plugins for design tools, such as Figma, Sketch, and Adobe XD, are the most popular integrations that I've been showing to and discussing with the teams. And they're loved by all types of players, by traditional banks, by neobanks, financial technology providers, white label products, and other players.
So it sounds to me like what we're saying is that product designers and teams like that, copywriters or UX designers, they have a huge role to play in the localization process. So what should they be doing?
Actually, I see more and more cases when companies empower product designers or other stakeholders like product analytics or copywriters to initiate the localization process once the design and the copy are ready. And I see sometimes them taking over the key creation process from developers in some cases. One can even structure and name design elements in certain ways to generate keys from these designs and text values, and so that they can produce some valid key names automatically if there is a certain pattern in structuring of design elements, artboards, and groups in design. And it's a big change in internal processes and responsibilities within teams to empower designers or other members to initiate changes in copy from design. And not everyone is ready for this, but it's really powerful. And sometimes I see some hybrid approaches when, for example, key creation stays with developers, while other parties become responsible for matching designs with texts. And this adds much value too, because it adds the content to the keys, and it also allows to preview the translations in design later on.
Before we move on, I have to mention I was on a call with a company called Withings. They're not a financial company, but rather a digital health company. But what they were saying is that they use a flow much like we're talking about here, and they reduce the time that it takes for them to localize their launches by 90%. So they were spending about 10 hours per language per launch, and they reduced that down to an hour, which is just a huge win for a team like that.
Yeah, definitely. And actually, when it comes to design-led development process that Withings has very successfully implemented, there are multiple other benefits besides just providing context or key creation. And we are talking here about 10x improvements in time to market and in cost saving. And let's stop for a moment here and look at this graph, and I can share one of the most common generic approaches in the design-led development process, but for sure it can be twisted and it is like changed by our customers in multiple ways. So one can take over the key creation from design and push the copy to be translated once the copy and design is finalized. Or similarly, if there are any changes in the existing copy, such changes can also be initiated from design. And then one can optionally notify relevant parties in Slack or in some other communication tools, just for everyone to be on the same page that there was some new content updated, so that those parties can initiate the translation and the review process. Or this creation of translation jobs can be even automated further. And once the content is translated, then one can pull translated text back into design and check how translations fit there. And if there are any changes required, then one can repeat the process and like make some changes in the copy and translations, and again, like pull it back and see how it looks in design. And so essentially, teams can start translating and previewing content even before the application is built and gets available for testing. And in a traditional approach, when the application is designed first and then built and then translated, then one can end up in a situation where translations don't fit the design, and either the copy or the layouts need to be rebuilt, and fixing such localization bugs can be quite costly. So especially if they're identified late. So it's a huge win for the teams.
Gotcha. So in this flow, developers are working on designs that have already been translated, and that reduces the amount of bugs, it reduces the back and forth and wasting of time. But what happens next in the flow? How is this pushed live?
Well, there are different ways. So by the time the application is ready and the copy and translations are approved, then all can be exported from Lokalise to some staging environment, and the team can test it and release the changes. But if one needs to make some changes in the copy or in the translations only, then for mobile apps, there is a possibility to use SDKs for over-the-air translation updates, which basically means that the team can update translations and fix some quality issues and errors on the fly without the need to ask for developers to deploy any fixes, and without asking them to send another version of the application for approval. So in the end, like developers, they usually don't care much about what the button should say, right? So you don't have to distract them to make necessary changes and to redeploy the app if it's just the copy or like some typo that needs to be like fixed. And thus you can always leave yourself some time for last minute changes, and which is why it's like really useful. And as Revolut mentioned back then in the case study, it probably took longer for Apple to review the app for them than for them to roll out a new language with us.
That's great. Actually, there's a question here, which I think is about this slide. So I'm going to put this up here. At which point is translation consistency and quality managed and ensured? And I'm assuming that because this question came in on this slide that we're talking about this process right here.
Yeah, I think that once the copy is updated from Figma, for example, or from other design tool, then one has to create a task so that translators can look into, like perform the necessary changes. And then there can be some back and forth. They can perform the translations, they can assure the quality, like perform some automatic changes, and they can pull translations back to the design tool. And if there are in-house people involved, then they can make some quality assurance when it comes to linguistic quality, and when it comes to the fact how translations fit next to each other. They can even check the quality in the design itself and fix it there. Or there can be a different approach when the teams check inside the design the translations which are not like final, but they just may want to see some copy to fill in to see how layouts fit in general, and if any like design needs to be rebuilt. And then they can still perform the quality review and some quality assurance checks afterwards, right before the translations are exported into the staging environment for some final changes, some final testing to be released. So it really depends. And in addition to that, it's also possible to use some in-context editors to see how translations fit in the app itself, not in the design. So it's up to you. There are various approaches, and I know teams that do this quite differently from each other.
Great, thanks very much for the question. All right, so you were telling me that we have a customer that uses Lokalise just for the OTA and Figma integration, and they're not performing any translations at all. So what other value would a team get from Lokalise? From this, what would a team like that get from Lokalise?
Yeah, that's true. And these are the two primary features and integrations that were the selling points in that case. And actually, there are several teams that use our tool without performing translations for their apps. And such teams get mostly the value from other features intended for developers. And it's very common that there is lots of overlapping content across platforms. For example, for iOS, for Android apps, for web applications. So there are several possibilities to manage cross-platform keys and content efficiently. And it's possible to merge the duplicates, reducing the double work in the development process itself. And for those who actually need to perform translations, then such keys, they will share the same translations, the same copy, and they also need to get translated and reviewed just once. And another quick win is that there can be some legacy content that doesn't require further translations, changes, or approvals that can also be identified and possibly archived. And there are teams that are very agile that need to manage various versions of the content and do very frequent releases. And translation and approval cycles also vary in terms of frequency of releases and in terms of the number of reviewable stages involved. So there are ways to build very custom workflows targeted to your needs, targeted to your frequency, targeted to the number of approval stages that you need to have. Just two examples here. One fintech company has 5 stages in its translation workflow, and it creates its own statuses to add visibility to all stakeholders involved about the current translation stage. And at the same time, they have quite an automated process with content updated daily and picked for translations also really fast, sometimes a few times a day. And once it reaches the transitions through all the translation stages and gets the final approved stage, it's also being picked up by their automation so that it's exported to be tested and released. And there is a totally different approach that, for example, one of the banks use. This particular bank has less frequent updates and quite lengthy sign-off process. So they do branches. They basically create another version of the project, but whenever there is any content that needs to be updated, and thus they segregate the content in production from the content that is currently requires changes and is being reviewed, and they allow their teams to touch that content and perform any necessary changes in copy and in translations in the new branch or without directly affecting any content that is in production. And once the changes are finalized and pass through all approval stages in a new branch, and translation statuses are also used there to show the current stage. And once the change is accepted by all stakeholders, only then they merge the branch and all the changes are applied to production at once they're signed off by all the parties. And it's actually one of the biggest values that teams see in a translation management system, and it's related to having a single source of truth for the content. As one of and it's not only about having a place where all the content lives, so that all parties know what they need to do if they need to translate anything, but it's also about people involved being on the same page. And as one of the banks that I recently talked to mentioned, previously it was a hassle for them to understand where the final copy lives, if it lives in production, if it lives in staging or like some demo environment, if it lives in Excel, Word, Figma, and even if they find the content, it's not necessarily checked if it fits the design at all. So establishing a translation management system as a single source of truth with the right process allows all parties to be aligned and all parties to have access to the latest version of the content and also to get its current approval status. So these are the most loved tech features that Lokalise has, some of which we've covered already. And there are also integrations with code repositories, integrations with content management systems, productivity tools, and some teams build their own and very custom integrations with Lokalise and their own tools using API, CLI, and webhooks. And in my opinion, any company shall think about automating things at some point. And it's especially true when it comes to technology-driven companies such as fintech and insurtech, because you cannot successfully disrupt the industry and like offer some like low cost, near zero transaction costs as some of the neobanks, for example, do, without being keen on optimizing internal processes, and localization is a big part of that. So there are teams that build their own very custom automations using API, CLI, and webhooks to have full visibility over all the key processes and changes happening to their content in the translation management system, to be able to pick translations and changes instantly and transfer content to the next stage as soon as possible in order to reduce the waste time.
All right, so we went on a journey. I'm going to do a quick wrap up. Now would be a great time if you have a question and you are either too shy or listening too intently. Now is a great time to put it into the questions tab. So I'll do a quick recap and then we can get to the Q&A with the remaining time. So if we zoom way out, we were focused on giving you, our audience, some tips to help you with three things: consistency, accuracy, and speed. We talked about creating and managing a glossary, as well as how utilizing a style guide and translation memory are key in this sometimes complex world of fintech. We also showed how context in the form of screenshots can help translators to do their best work. And we also talked about how some forward-thinking companies are starting the localization process at the design stage with product designers and copywriters and doing most of the work before a single line of code is even written. Then we talked about the importance of a single source of truth for localization. And I'm sure that is something that anyone who has attempted localizing an app before can tell you is critical. And finally, we very briefly touched on some of the features that make Lokalise a natural choice for tech-forward teams, like a well-documented API and tons of SDKs and more. So if you have any suggestions on topics you would like to hear about from us in the future, please do add them to the chat. And with that, let's go ahead and look at a couple of these questions that have popped up and also give you an idea of what you could do next. Again, these are links that you'll be able to click on when the deck is distributed, but you can always go to learn more by booking a free demo at lokalise.com. There's a button there that says free demo, and we have a good 30 minutes that you can sign up with an expert who will help walk you through a very customized presentation of Lokalise so you can understand how it might fit into your workflow. And then obviously we're on most of your favorite social media, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and more coming up. So with that, I'm going to ask a couple questions. We'll start with this one, which was came in pretty early. So what about queries management?
Yeah, to be honest, I'm not completely sure what this question means. Maybe we can, the person asking it can elaborate on it a little bit, and while we will take the next one.
That sounds great.
Thank you.
And then another one that came in, which is financial institutions often have complicated architectures where we need to integrate multiple systems with Lokalise. How do we build efficient workflows when Lokalise does not support concurrent access?
Well, that's a good question, and there are definitely workarounds to still get quite like concurrent access and to send concurrent calls to Lokalise, and it can be achieved with either creating different users or different tokens per user. But this is something that, or someone can create queues for sending their requests, or there can be some other workarounds. But this is something that we've been actively looking at. And I don't want to make any announcements or promises at this point, but we are definitely aware and working on this. But so far, it has not been a blocker to any of our customers. And we have quite large customers with lots of dependencies, like few hundreds of projects. We have teams that have fully automated workflows, like in the places where it can be automated. So it's not a complete blocker. And if you are considering us and it's the only limitation, then please get in touch and we can explore the possibilities. Or I can give you some an update on what we are looking into, but I'll need to confirm that we can make any public official statements on this.
Great. All right. And we have an update to the original question about the query. So having a visual context as a screenshot is great for the linguist, but is there a way to manage queries from a linguist in the tool? Does that clarify?
Got you. Yeah. These
Okay.
types of queries. Yeah, currently we don't have proper functionality for this, but we have quite limited functionality, and there is still a possibility to leave comments on a translation level, and one can directly reply to the comment and bring some clarifications. But if you're asking about full-fledged query tool where you can resolve the comments, then this is not something that is available yet. But we certainly get similar feedback, and this is something that we are considering for possible improvements in future.
Gotcha. So it sounds to me like if somebody wants this right now, we have some collaboration features in the localization tool that might be able to accomplish some of these things that they would want to do. Is that right?
Yeah,
okay.
Definitely. One can leave a comment and reply to the comment. One can add some notifications, enable that if someone leaves a comment, there is a notification sent, for example, to Slack, and then people can discuss it further in Slack and bring or reply directly in our chat. So to some extent, this can also be addressed in the tool.
All right, we have another one here. So how is the localization done for API documentation as it involves lots of coding and focuses on developers?
Yeah, I don't think that I'm not sure that I fully got the question, but I'll try to respond to the best. Please type if it's not clear enough. So we have some functionalities, like we support first documents type of projects, and we support keys and strings. So if it's a document, you can insert it as a document. And also we have some, we identify some placeholders that don't need to be translated. And we have some automatic QA checks that can check that if there are pieces of code, like if there are placeholders or if there are any replacers, that they don't need to be translated. So to some extent, we can support this, but you will still need to test it because depending on what is exactly in your documentation, there can be some limitations. And in the worst case scenario, we'll still support all the text and we'll be able to translate it. It's just a convenient thing. If we recognize something as a placeholder or replacer or as code, then we will kind of wrap it up into blocks and show that should not be translated. But if we don't support it, we'll just add it as plain text.
Great. And so it sounds to me like what we're saying there is like, in your typical API document, there's a long code block that kind of gives you the hello world, right, of what you're trying to accomplish. But in our tool, you can go ahead and denote those as being blocks of code that don't need anybody's attention as far as translating. Is that one of the key parts we're saying here?
Yeah, it depends based on the document. If this can be converted automatically, or if not, then you should probably just agree, like discuss with your translators, like what they need to translate and what they don't need to. So it's hard for me to visualize how exactly it looks like, but yeah, this needs to be tested. Like some replacer, some hyperlinks and stuff like this. It's already recognized by us that it's not localizable text to some extent.
So we have two more questions, and I think looking at time, we'll try to answer these two questions. Of course, if you have other questions you want, please do fill them out, and we will get back to you probably in a written format. So let's look at these two that we have here. One is, could you provide an overview on capacity? What is the maximum capacity that can be uploaded, amount of users who can work simultaneously on a project, and also what are the ISO standards of the tool in regards to security, privacy, and confidentiality? I know for that last, just in the interest of time, I'll say at least for that last question, we've documented all of that on our website as far as our security standards and certifications. So that's all there and easily available on Lokalise. These other ones might be in the documentation, but do you happen to know off the top of your head?
Yeah, I think that we ISO certified, definitely. We have the 27001 certificate and like some more certifications, I guess. We'll need to double check yeah, you can check the website, but I can assure you that we work with pretty large banks and financial institutions. Some of them we cannot even name publicly. And so this should not be a problem. And so if you have any questions related to that, just reach out and we'll provide with all the necessary documentation and forms to be filled in. And in terms of capacity, we don't have limits like as such. Some of the, like our pricing model is tied to like usage. Definitely. So to some extent, capacity is limited by the plan and the contract that you're using. But overall, there hasn't been any volume that we couldn't support so far. And we have teams like with hundreds or like even like thousands of users. We have like teams with, I don't know, like hundreds of projects. We have like quite big projects as well, like with I know millions of ports and like stuff like that. So there are basically, yeah, we were not faced with limitations when we couldn't support something like that, and there is no limit on how many users can work simultaneously on a project as well. So to the best of my knowledge, if you, I don't know, if you have some huge volumes, then you can reach out to us and like double check, but should not be the problem. Has never been a problem so far.
Sounds good. And we'll do this last one. We're running just a little bit over, but since there's only one more, we might as well do it, which is it possible to add your own custom machine translation engine to the project workflow?
Not yet, but I don't want to give any promises here since I'm not a product team, but we definitely get some interest for this from customers. At the moment, one can use only Google and DeepL in terms of translation engines.
Great. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you to everybody who participated and for all those great questions. And we'll be distributing the materials later. You can share with your friends, colleagues, family, whoever's interested in localization. Thank you very much.
Thank you for participating. Have a great day.